And Mark, is great to be here with you. It's the first time we've shared this type of stage. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and especially because we're going to be talking about music, about film, and how these two art forms merge, and joining forces between them, you can achieve results that are greater than the sum of their individual parts. And my first question is about how that relationship between music and film came about and how it has evolved over time.
Fernando, good to see you. Good to see everybody here. Um, it's great pleasure to be at the university. I have a lot of respect for what you're trying to do here, and the students are quite quite interesting and capable. Music and movies are really they grew up together. In silent film, they used to play a record while a film was playing. And sometimes they had a piano player who would, whose purpose was to drive the emotion that you see on screen. So when the girl was tied to the train tracks, and when people would embrace it, so it has always been together, music and film. But as the years went by and sound came in, the first official sound movie, although not really the first, but the credited first sound film, The Jazz Singer, is a film where only the music is live. Al Jolson, American performer, sings in the film, and that's really the first time people heard sound coordinated with somebody speaking or singing. Film began as an educational tool. Thomas Edison, who did most of the inventing, wanted it. He was a very practical guy, and he wanted everything done for a practical reason. So he thought that film would be perfect for history, newsreels, an educational tool. He had no idea that film could also be entertaining and creative as a medium. All of that began when, in the Lower East Side of New York City, um, which was a working class, poor working class neighborhood, they would hang sheets in little storefronts and show movies, silent movies. And it was such a shock for people to see pictures that moved, moving pictures, that it became a phenomenon relatively quickly. And as it did, as it grew into an organized medium, so did music. And um, I always think of movies as the visual equivalent of music, and music as the oral equivalent of movies. That's why I always tell my students here and in the museum that I curate in New York, in Chicago, if you want to hear music, listen to music. If you want to see a film, watch a film. Film is a visual medium. And what music does in film is it drives the emotions, same thing as it did 100 years ago. Um, when Mike Nichols, director, directed The Graduate, 67 or 68, he did something that nobody had ever done before. He took music that had nothing to do with the film. He took Simon and Garfunkel's music and put it on the film where it had nothing directly to do with the story or the characters. He just liked the sound of it. He was shaving one morning, and his brother um, was visiting and said, "Why don't you listen to this album? It's great." He put it on. And he said, "Oh, so I'll use it in the film, like a stew. Okay, we'll throw it in there." What that did was that opened up a whole new world of music in film, where you didn't have to have music drive the story forward or develop the characters. That's mainly what Broadway does in a show like Oklahoma. You have the music as a way to progress the story and develop character. That's no longer the case, really. Today, you hear every type of music in any type of movie, and we're just so used to it now that we put them together. But I think they are two distinct media, and that the generation that I grew up with in the Old West in the 18th century, no, only kidding. The generation I grew up with thought of music as movies. You know, you would listen, for example, a Beatle album, Sergeant Pepper. That was like a movie. You know, it had a beginning, had a middle, had an end, had romance, it had adventure. Listen to something by Van Morrison, for example, Astral Weeks, an album like that. It's an autobiography of his life with emphasis on his childhood. Beautifully done. Van Morrison, highly talented, unique performer, but not applicable to movies. And then you have movies where a star of the film who's not a musician will suddenly think that they can perform music because they think of it as the same as film, where in fact it's utterly different. The language is different, the construction is different, um, and the application of it is different. So when I was growing up, music was never background; it was always in the foreground. When I was a kid in New York City, we had basically AM radio, you know, before FM, and you could have it on in your house, leave your apartment, go down to the street, and still hear the radio. Everybody would have their windows open in the summertime, cars would go by, and everybody listened to the same thing. And it became a kind of a soundtrack for us. You know, we I can remember with friends in college, a Rolling Stones album came out, and this is how crazy we were. Um, Somebody had a big sound system in their room where they lived, and we all got together, five of us, and we watched the album. You know, you stared at the speakers and watched the album. I mean, that's how crazy and obsessive we were, and then analyzed it. You know, oh, do you hear the way that drum piece came in and those lyrics? So, as a creative form, it's very different from movies. And when first book I wrote was a music book. So as I became more involved with learning about film, I always went to films as a kid. My parents would take me because they didn't want to pay a babysitter, so they dragged along to the film. And then by the age of 9 or 10, I would go to one of the big palaces and ask somebody online to say that I was their son so I could get in to see the film. It didn't matter what it was, I just wanted to see it, not realizing what the connection was for me. So, music and film were both personal media. I always felt that Van Morrison made that album for me, you know, and that nobody else needed to hear it, or that a film like On the Waterfront was made just for me. I had no idea that these were communal, universal forms of entertainment and art. So through the years, as I've been writing, whenever I do a series of books about movies, I will always then switch to music because it reminds me of the oral aspect of creativity. And it just makes me want to listen and then go back to the movies where I can watch. So they're similar in that way that they, as a critic, as a historian, as a student, I find that both of them have defined my career and my life. When I was growing up in New York City, kids used to get together on the street corners and sing in four-part harmony with no instruments. And it was a ritual. It was part of growing, and it was really the first social interaction with music beside the radio. Hey, you can get up and actually sing, and you don't need instruments. It was called a cappella music, street corner music. And so when something brings you into itself, it's very exciting. When I was a kid, I had an 8 millimeter movie camera. And the only thing that stopped me from filming everything was the expense of getting film developed. But I walked around with it like a cowboy movie, a cowboy western walks around with a gun on his side. I mean, I filmed everything, and that's how you learn. You connect what you like with who you are. You discover what you like because of who you are, and you develop who you are because of what you like. So I've been very fortunate in my life to be able to do what I want in certain aspects um, my whole life. And not only lucky that way, but fortunate to be able to keep on learning. It's a kind of a fountain of youth for me. And when I teach, it gives me a chance to learn what that generation, that um, group thinks of what they're seeing, and I learn from that. I don't teach; I share. It's an interaction to try to understand what we are seeing, what we are hearing, and how it relates to us. So I think that's the answer to that question. I hope it's the answer to that question.
No, definitely. And I have a few follow-up questions and just a comment because you mentioned the first inventions, the projections.
Right.
And I think the same thing happened with music. I think Edison invented the first phonographs, and they were designed to, in his mind, to capture like messages from personal assistants, and then
Right.
people would play them back. But he was not thinking about an art form, as you say. He was thinking in very practical terms. So I just think it's interesting that the same uh, the same principles were applied to the technology, and something completely different happened afterwards.
Well, the thing that changed music was the invention of the phonograph, because before you had recorded music, you had sheet music. And somebody would be in a department store and they would be playing sheet music. And people would say, I want to play that at home. So they would buy the sheet music. But the only way you actually made money was by performing. So every night you'd go out and do a show, and that was it. And then you could buy the sheet music, which was not the same as seeing the show. But the recording of music made it possible for you to do it once and have a royalty system that would pay you uh, as long as your music sold, and that changed the industry. So just like in film, when sound came in, technology is not the enemy of art. Technology actually comes out of a need. How can we make money without having to do it every night? Create a system that will do it. Then, when you create that system, phonographs, long plays, 45s, CDs, cassettes, you keep on improving it. And as you improve it, the ability to record it gets better. Suddenly, you have technology that will suit what you want to do. They go back to the Beatles. Sergeant Pepper is impossible to make 10 years earlier,
Yeah.
because of the advancement in technology. So they go hand in hand. Sound comes to film, color comes to film, widescreen comes to film, and each step changes the product. So, the medium is the message. Um, that famous media critic. And it's true, the medium does change the message. I always tell my students that film is not theater, it's not filmed theater. It's a separate art that does things that you can't do live. It's a plastic medium. And what has helped film immensely is the invention of video cassettes and um, DVDs, DVRs. People may not remember, but in the late 70s, I guess it was, when video, home video began, all the studios were against it. There were years of lawsuits about people stealing movies by recording them off television or whatever. And, it took some genius in Hollywood to say, wait a minute, we can sell these films and bring back all these films that nobody has ever seen because they only get released for a year or two and then they're gone. We could actually make money off of those films. And so instead of being the enemy of technology, they became a friend of technology. And now, movies that were made in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, the 60s, you can get them on high tech DVD, and everybody makes money, the actors, the writers, the directors. So rather than being an enemy of creativity, film and music are aided by creativity, as creativity is aided by product. So there is something to be said for both aspects, technically and creatively. They work together.
Yeah. And you were mentioning that music and film are very different mediums. How would you describe those differences and how do they complement each other?
They're different primarily because you listen to music, you hear music, but you watch films, you see films. Films are a visual medium. And I always like to, when we do clips, take the sound completely off and show you what is actually going on. Because several generations since radio became a medium for popular music, we have grown up accustomed to listening. Top 40 radio, concerts, all of that. And in the beginning of the phenomenon of live concerts, nobody did anything on stage except sing. No light shows, no trickery, none of that. It was just getting up and singing. But we've grown up with the idea that songs are so great, popular music so great, that we think we see it. We think we see music um, in our minds. Conversely, we think we hear movies. And while they complement each other, they are very, very different. And the generations now are so attuned to music, to the attitudes and changes in music, pop, rock, disco, hip hop, whatever rocks your boat, not to make a pun, um, that we think we see it. And so a lot of younger people, go to the movies and they listen to the movies. And when you listen to a movie, you are missing the best part of the film, which is the medium of moving pictures.
Mhm.
So I always when I start a class, I always try to differentiate between music, soundtrack, and film because you can be distracted, like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. You know, you can be distracted by those poppy fields and lose your way on the road. You've got to be able to differentiate the media. One is oral, one is visual.
Mhm.
And then you're on your way to understanding both better.
Mhm.
You know, the music of your mind, as
Yeah.
some songs says, or the movie in my mind, you know, a popular song. Film is something else. Music, you listen to a lot of times by yourself,
Mhm.
you know, in the car or while you're cooking or whatever you're reading the paper. Film is something you have to go to. Not so much anymore with with home video, but the idea was it was a communal experience as opposed to an individual experience. That's why comedy doesn't work as well on home video because there's no response.
Mhm.
You don't hear people laughing. So when you're in a theater and you're watching a comedy and people start laughing, you know it's contagious. You get it. Uh, with music, it's you can understand music by yourself um, if you can connect to what you're listening to. It's not necessarily something you have to go to. It comes to you. Now
Mhm.
with DVD today, with all the progress, when you watch a comedy at home, you don't laugh. You might say, "Oh, that's funny," or
Mhm.
"Oh, I like the way they did that." But you don't sit in your living room or wherever you're watching videos.
Uh-huh.
You know, it's not what you do by yourself. But when you're listening to music, you start singing along. You know, you start thumping on your desk or whatever you're doing, or you go to the piano. You try to do it. So it's just different.
Mhm.
The two media. Usually, you find people who love making movies aren't great musicians.
Mhm.
Great musicians do not make great movies. Why? Because musicians are oriented to the sound and filmmakers are oriented to the picture.
Yeah.
And when you try to mix those media, it's very difficult
Mhm.
to do. That's why you have, when you make movies, you have a music producer.
Yeah.
You don't do it yourself. You have someone who knows what they're doing.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's the difference, I think.
And I think that leads me to my next question because most people here are aspiring directors and they will use music as part of their storytelling, like choosing tracks and collaborating with musicians or producers, as you say, to create the soundtracks or the scores for the films they are creating. So I wanted to ask. I have two questions. The first one is, who would you consider would be great directors that either themselves or the people they collaborate with have made a great job of um, creating music that accompanies a film? Like, which would be those great examples as The Graduate, as you mentioned?
Well, classically, I think the best writer of music and conducting, well, actually, the writing of it would be Bernard Herrmann,
Mhm.
who did a lot of Hitchcock films and many, many other films. And conducting, I think Muir Matheson, who you may not know the name, but you certainly have heard him conduct on soundtracks. Um, you know, when Mike Nichols did that, again, the ignorance of the medium is that they tried to prevent him from using music that wasn't connected to the film. And you know, only the success of The Graduate turned everybody around saying, "Oh, wait a minute, you know, that's a good idea." But most people in Hollywood and in music are followers. You know, if something If something works, if Spider-Man works, then you make 50 Spider-Man. If the Avengers works, you make 50 Avengers. If the Rolling Stones hit, eh, you make 50 Rolling Stones albums that are really kind of the same album, really Chicago blues music, Memphis blues music, three chord stuff that they
Mhm.
elaborate on and put vocals on. So the real creativity is the genesis, the one who starts it, the one who brings something new. That's the creative process at its height. When the Beatles started, they were different. Even though they borrowed a lot of American music, what they did with it, playing instruments in a club, nobody did that.
Uh-huh.
The people would get up and sing, and there'd be a band over there. But they got up and played their own music. That was a genesis for which all bands now do, and not for the better, but they
Mhm.
all do it. So those would be the people that I think have been most influential. Pop stars occasionally can do it. Elvis Costello does a nice job of writing to music, writing to film, but it's much more difficult, mainly because directors are egomaniacs
Mhm.
and they don't want to share in a good way. They don't want to share the spotlight with music. Conversely, musicians want the film to say starring so and so in, and as a
Mhm.
musician, they want the name to be. So it's part of the industry. They're two different industries, but they blend. They when they work together, they produce magic,
Mhm.
and that's the best part of it, I think.
Yeah. And as the graduate, as an example, do you have like a selection of films that showcase that magic that you can think of? Okay, I can see these two industries colliding and creating something beautiful in this and this film.
Well, most music that works on film is now concert music.
Hmm.
Where they film a concert. Something I really dislike because you don't get more than 5 seconds of a shot, and they try to kinetically match the energy of the performers. I mean, sometimes when you watch a movie of any performance, live performance, it's maddening. You get dizzy from all the cuts, and the director wants to show you how hip he is to the
Hmm.
music, and the musicians don't want their music interrupted. They're trying to perform, so it's difficult. I could think of several movies that do it, but they're not memorable to me. I
Hmm.
prefer, where I'm staying down here. I prefer to watch the Spanish language movies
Hmm.
because I don't know what they're talking about. By and large, I have picked up of a few phrases.
Uh-huh.
Muchas gracias, a great phrase to
Yeah.
have in Spanish. No matter what anybody says, you say muchas gracias, your best friend. Um, uh, but by watching the Spanish movies without knowing most of the language,
Hmm.
you are focused on watching. And I can tell you that most of the films I've seen, I could tell you what they're about just from watching them. So I'll tell you something else about music and movies where they come together. When I write biographies, you have to break down the magic. You have to show how the magic is made, especially in movies and music. And when you break down, when you show how the trick is done, the magic goes away. When you see in films about music, making music, and magically the star of the film, the first take, it's
Yeah.
the greatest thing in the world, and then it goes on. Then you see the montage of records being sold and people screaming in the audience, and we know you, me, most of the people here, that music is a difficult thing to put on record, especially in the digital age. That it looks like a spaceship when you go into a studio. The same thing with film. You might do 30 takes of a shot, but when you write about it, how the components work, the greatest thing is that the magic comes back.
Mhm.
So even though you see where the rabbit comes from, and you say, "Oh well, now I know where it is," you go back and you watch that trick, and all the magic returns. So understanding the process doesn't ruin the product. I think it enhances the product. So
Mhm.
directors out there, um, semiotics, for example, which I'm not a fan of, will teach you what a long shot is, what a short shot is. In music, what echo is, what glass, how glass is used. Um, but then you put 10 people in a studio or 10 people making a film with the same subject, and each film will be different. Each recording will be different. And that's because semiotics is not enough. It's not enough to understand the ingredients. You have to know how to take those ingredients and turn them into something personal and artistic.
Mhm.
So I think when you teach film, you need to take the magic away and then let it come back. In music, we just saw in a film class 2 films about musicians.
Mhm.
One film about musicians, one about film. A Star is Born. We saw the 54 version and the 76 version, 1976. And what's interesting about these, the second film and the first film in terms of movies, that you never see in 54 with Judy Garland and James Mason, you never see James Mason perform. He's just a star. And what does that mean? That means he could go backstage, crowds love him, and you never see him actually making a movie. In A Star Is Born, in that one great song from the film Evergreen, they're sitting in the studio, in the recording studio. They do one take, and it's perfect, and it
Mhm.
becomes a big hit. That's the way music and film want you to think it's done. They don't want you to know about the drudgery, because it's not appealing.
Mhm.
It's not appealing. If you watch a painter paint a landscape, it might take him a week, it might take him a month, it might take him a day, but you don't want to watch that process. You want to see the finished painting. So when you study art, you have to show how it's done,
Mhm.
and then you can look at the painting and say, "Oh man, what a great painting!" But appreciate it on a higher level, on a better level. When you make a movie, it's not enough. I always tell my classes, you can learn from bad movies almost as much as, or if not more, than from good movies. But you have to understand the process. When you make, when you record music, as you well know, the balancing, the um, the production end of it, the repetition, take 50, to try to get it exactly the way it will be for the rest of its existence. People don't want to see that. I remember the Buddy Holly story a couple of
Mhm.
years ago, the biography, like every film biography. 1 minute, he's a poor kid in the studio. He sings a song. Oh, how great that is. The next minute, he's driving Cadillacs and, building houses for his mother. I mean, that's the way we want to believe all of that works. Um, Not so. Not
Mhm.
so. And if you just want to go to movies and be entertained, that's great. If you just want to have music on in the background while you're making dinner, great. Um, but if you want to approach it as an art form, then you need to understand the mechanics and the creativity and how they work together. And that's what film school is about. We are preparing you, giving you the tools, hopefully, and giving you a chance to learn, experiment, try things. And then when you go out in the world of film and music, you're prepared. You know what you're doing. You understand how you connect to your art, and that's really all that we do is try to help you understand why you like what you like, so you can then understand why you like what you do and hope other people like it too.
I really like what you've just said, and especially about understanding art at a better level. And that's what we expect from people in this space, to not just see a film, but go beyond the experience of being entertained. And the same with music. And if music is going to be employed as a resource, and we want people to go beyond what is in the mainstream or beyond their personal taste, I would like to ask you, like, who do you think, if people want to do like a historical appraisal of those musicians that have transformed music as we know it today, which genres or artists would you recommend our students to get into and study?
Well, it's a tricky question because it's such a personal decision that you make. It's an organic connection. I'll give you an example of what I mean. When I was a kid, I hated Frank Sinatra. And my father would play Frank Sinatra. Oh my God, what is this? Guy sitting alone at a bar drinking. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. What is he talking about? But as I got older and started going to bars at 3 o'clock in the morning, not smoking, um, suddenly I got it. So I think you have to be a certain age to appreciate certain music. You take the Monkees, if you remember the Monkees, they really lead you to the Beatles. Today in music, I like Taylor Swift. I think Taylor Swift is a tremendous songwriter. Her songs do not sound like other people's songs, and she's a great performer. And you
Mhm.
can go back and listen to the early music and listen to all of it, which is necessary in any art form. You can hear the growth. You can hear the growth, the sophistication of her music that comes with self learning
Mhm.
and connecting to an audience. Ah, that works. That connects to an audience. So maybe 50-year-old people, or those old folks, uh, maybe they listen to Taylor Swift and they go, "Oh God, what is that?" Or white people listening to hip hop and saying, "Oh my God, where's the melody?" I mean, it's just, where are the lyrics? I can't even understand them. So there is something to be said for where you are in your life to what appeals to you. Now, I think Frank Sinatra, great,
Mhm.
but you have to get there.
Mhm.
You have to get there. So it doesn't matter who you like. It matters why you like them,
Mhm.
what appeals to you, what's important to you. It I don't teach as much as I'd like to because I have a little career called writing. Um, but it's always the same with wherever I do seminars or teaching. In the beginning, everybody wants to talk about plot or why they like the movie because they like the actor or this. And as you go along, gradually, you hear the change where students start talking about style, about art, about what works, what doesn't work. When you're learning music, classical music, let's say, and you're listening to Chopin and falling asleep in the middle because Chopin will put you to sleep in a good way. And then you listen to Mozart and you jump up and down and say, yes, Mozart was the rock star of his day. He was the Elton John of his century, so 17th or 18th century. Um, so the context of the music or the movies that you like is also connected to where you are in your life.
Mhm.
I tell my students that most films end, romantic films, with couples getting married and living happily ever after. Nobody makes movies about the difficulties of marriage, and the fighting, the worries about money, the children screaming all hours of the day and night. Not all kids, but some kids. Um, Budgets, rent, leases, mortgages. That's not what people want to see. People want to see the romance. And so you have to acclimate yourself to what is real and what is ideal.
Mhm.
And both in music, I love you so much. Um, and then someone like a Bob Dylan comes along and sings "I Hate You So Much," and it sounds so great. Um, in film, Orson Welles, Hitchcock, Ford, you connect to them at different times of your life. If you see Vertigo when you're 12 years old, or 15 years old, or 20 years old, it's a very difficult film to like. But if you see Vertigo when you're 30, 40, or 50, and you've had your heart broken a few hundred times, and you have this desire to bring back the past, bring back the happiness, then you realize what a great movie that is. And that's just an example. Um, in all stages of your life, when your values change and grow, so does your appreciation of what you see and what you hear. So it's hard to say, well, this one person is so great today.
Mhm.
Maybe in 10 years, not so great. Um, this is the nature of creativity. Most creativity, as James Joyce pointed out, is a young man's and a young woman's game. The portrait of an artist as a young man. You do your best work like athletes. Think of athletes. They do their best work early in their lives, when they are primed. You do your best creative work, I think, when you're young. And then as you get older, you develop what you discovered early.
Mhm.
So you don't wake up one morning at 60 years old and say, I'm going to write a hit song. I mean, it doesn't work that way. Or I'm going to make the greatest movie ever made. You need to live your life in a realm that makes sense to you, like studying film, like studying music.
Mhm.
And you start with inspiration. And then as your life goes on, you develop that inspiration to a point where it's both commercial and it's creative. And that's usually the timeline. You
Mhm.
start off creative, and then you make compromises as you go along to stay creative.
Mhm.
Most people, once they become successful, the creativity is not that important.
Yeah.
Um, and you wonder how important it ever was. Now, this book I just wrote about Merle Haggard, he lived the American dream and the American nightmare at the same time. And so, fame, what we think is so great about fame, in real life, fame may not be that great. Um, and that's why I write about creative people, because I want to show people that it's not all applause and money and houses and girls or boys or whatever. Um, it's much more complicated than that. Devoting your life to an art,
Mhm.
very difficult. To music, to film, to painting, to whatever your art is. Um, and the reason I say it's a young man's or woman's game is because the pressure to survive, the economic pressure, the social pressure, a lot of people can't handle it. And so you make TV sitcoms, you make hit singles, and you forget about the reason you're there in the first place. That becomes your job, is TV sitcoms. Um, It's a tricky business. Creativity is a tricky business, and even trickier to talk about because my mustard is your ketchup. My ketchup is your mustard. So it's about you. In your career, in your music career, there is one part of you that wants to be totally creative. There's another part of you that wants to be successful. So you can continue to be creative, but in order to become successful, you have to make a compromise to make your music more accessible. And a lot of times people then stop being creative and just go for the number one record or the number one album. And that's all that becomes an end to creativity. So that would be my answer.
and I guess I'm going to ask you your personal answer to this, but how do you nurture that creativity and you sustain it and you do that balancing act between success and sustaining creativity?
uh, I'm not a good example because I've had a very long career. And if you put me in a factory and said, sew this together, I'd be lost. It's the only thing I can do really is write and maybe a little teaching and a little entertaining TV shows and stuff like that. Um, the way to learn about film is to watch film. That's why I don't like to show clips. I like to show movies. When you see documentaries about musicians and they show you 8 bars and then they stop and they talk and then they move and they show another 8 bars, it's not fair to the musician. A song is a unit and you should hear the whole thing. Um, my advice to people how to do it is to keep doing it, to become uh, addicted to what you do in a good way, obsessive, and in my classes, you have to see the film. You have to see film to learn film, and then after break it down. So yeah, everybody's different. Everybody has a different meaning to their art. You take Henry Miller, and then you can compare him to Norman Mailer. You've got same subject approached very differently, not competitively. One feeds the other. So my personal career, great, but the reason, as far as I'm concerned, but the reason for my doing it, very personal, very comes out of a lot of my early years when I was trying to understand why I was different, which wasn't a good thing in my early part of my life. I didn't like a lot of things you were supposed to like. I liked other things. My parents were convinced that I was going, when I told my mother I was going to be a writer, she started crying. So you have to be committed. And a little failure is very good for you. It's very, very good for you. It becomes a Darwinian thing, a survival of the fittest. You make a movie, you fail, make another movie. You make an album, nobody buys it, make another album. Do what you have to do to keep going. So, what would be my advice?
That's great. No, thank you. Thank you. That's great advice for me as well. And I think with time, I think we can move on to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, we can take them now, and we have a few minutes for it.
I wanted to ask you, why do you consider that film is, I mean, why do you consider that the soul of film is just wait a minute. Let me think how I'm gonna ask you
Take
this.
your time.
Uh-huh. So basically, you always say that you don't listen to film, you watch film. But then I think about, for example, a picture. You only watch or no, sorry, a painting,
Mhm.
you just watch the painting, or for example a photography. So why do you say that you should just watch a film and not listen to it simultaneously.
First of all, I don't say don't listen to it, only if you're in a foreign country where you don't understand the language. I mean, it all works together. It's like something I said in I think that class where if you have a plane, you have people who put the fuel in, you have the people who load the luggage in, you have the hostesses or hostess who give you bad water. You have um, somebody in the back row screaming and kicking. But who's flying the plane? The pilot. And so all the components of film, screenwriting, producing, sound, it all works. But remember, it's moving pictures. It's not moving music, it's moving pictures. And the art that developed into cinema was the art of one person being able to make films that are both intimate and universal. That's what auteurism is. So yes, you need music, but you could have film without music, but you couldn't have that music without that film. It film is made to accompany. Sorry, music is made to accompany film to drive the audience. It's a product of the making of a film, and of course you have a story. Although, as you all know by now, I'm not big on stories because they're all the same. What I'm big on is how the story is told. And so, yes, you need a screenwriter. Yes, you need musicians. But as we've seen in our class the last week or two, the best films have no music. The best films have very little music because it's the visual impact that is the definition of moving pictures. So, which is not to say that there isn't great music out there or great dialogue, but when you talk about plays, for example, you don't say, "Did you see so and so's production of Hamlet?" Or you might say that, but what normally you say is, "What a great writer Shakespeare was." Let's go see some Shakespeare. Let's go see Tennessee Williams because you want to hear their plays performed. And one night you might have one guy playing it, another night you might have another guy doing the role. You might have a one company that's in the round. I mean, but it's all Shakespeare. It's all Tennessee Williams. In film, it's one time. It's one film that is made, like Face in the Crowd that we saw the other night, that reverberates and resonates through the years. Nobody remembers Free Man in the Morning or Mama Guitar. It's part of the film for sure. But what people remember is how that film looks, the visual of that film, which is Kazan and astonishing. So that's kind of my answer. I'm certainly not saying only look at silent films and don't go to bad movies. I'm not saying that at all. All movies are good in a sense, and all movies are bad in a sense too.
Thank you.